Welcome to the training module on SBP Standard 2, feedstock verification. In this module, I'll walk you through Standard 2, covering both version 2.0 and the updated version 2.1. Also, this module assumes you've already completed the earlier session on Standard 1. The two standards work hand in hand, so a solid grasp of Standard 1 is essential for everything we'll cover here. Let's get started. Here is what we will cover in this module. First, I will present the purpose and contents of Standard 2, what it is for, and how it fits into the wider SBP framework. Next, we will link the standard to its companion guidance document. You will want to keep the guidance close at hand when applying these requirements in practice. Then we will spend time on the concept of the supply-based evaluation, the risk-based method that sits at the heart of Standard 2. Finally, we will go through the requirements in detail, covering version 2.0 as well as the revisions introduced in version 2.1. Revised v2.1 requirements are highlighted with dark teal color. Let's begin. Standard 2 is in many ways the engine of the SBP certification scheme. It's the core standard that drives how biomass producers evaluate and manage the sustainability of the feedstock they source. The scheme takes a risk-based approach. Biomass producers assess the risk of non-compliance with the principles and criteria of Standard 1 when deciding which feedstock to source, and Standard 2 gives them the method to identify, evaluate, and adequately mitigate those risks. Risks are rated either as low or as specified. Where risks are specified, the organization must manage them, reducing them to a low level or excluding the feedstock from SBP supply chains altogether. There are also special requirements for processing residues and post-consumer feedstocks, which we'll cover in detail later in the module. A quick word on timing. Version 2.0 was published on the 10th of May 2023, became effective on the 10th of August 2023, with a transition period running to the 9th of November 2024. Version 2.1 is an evolutionary update, mostly clarifying terminology, with 4 new requirements, clauses 3.12, 5.3.5, 5.4, and 7.4. It will be published on the 29th of April 2026, effective from the 29th of July 2026, with the transition period running to the 28th of October 2027. Over the next slides, we'll go through all the requirements of Standard 2 in detail. Before we go any further, let us put the two standards side by side so the relationship is clear. Standard 1 defines the sustainability bar that feedstock must clear. It sets out 4 principles, 8 criteria, and 45 indicators covering legality, biodiversity, environmental protection, climate, carbon, sourcing, social and community impacts. Standard 1 answers the question, what does sustainable feedstock look like? Standard 2 is the verification engine. It does not add new sustainability requirements on top of Standard 1. Instead, it gives biomass producers a structured, risk-based method for demonstrating that the feedstock they source meets Standard 1 in practice. Standard 2 answers the question, how does a biomass producer prove that its feedstock clears the bar? The two standards are designed to work together. Standard 1 without Standard 2 is a statement of intent with no mechanism behind it. Standard 2 without Standard 1 has no bar to verify against. Before we go into the detail, let us take a quick look at how Standard 2 is structured. This overview will help you see how the pieces fit together. The standard is built around risk management, and it sets out a logical sequence of steps for organizations to evaluate and manage the risks of sourcing feedstock. Section 1. Supply-based definition and mapping. The organization defines and maps its supply base, identifying the sources and geographical boundaries of its feedstock. Section 2. Traceability to the supply base. A traceability system links feedstock back to the supply base, providing accountability throughout the supply chain. Section 3, Supply Base Evaluation, or SBE, a structured evaluation to identify potential sustainability risks and to inform sourcing decisions. Section 4. Supply base reporting. The organization reports on its supply base, including sourcing practices, risk findings, and mitigation measures. This is where transparency is demonstrated. Section 5. Supply base verifiers, or SBVs. These are the evidence sources the organization uses to verify that practices align with the indicators in Standard 1. Section 6. Risk assessment. A comprehensive assessment of the likelihood and consequences of risks across the supply base. Where an SBP regional risk assessment is available, the organization uses it directly. Section 7. Risk management. Where specified risks are identified, the organization develops and implements a plan with specific measures to mitigate them. Section 8. Stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders are actively involved in the process so that diverse perspectives are considered in decision making. Annex 1 covers the specific requirements for processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. Taken together, these sections give organizations a complete framework for managing sustainability risks against the criteria in Standard 1, and it is this framework that enables them to make SBP-compliant claims. Let us open with the end state, the destination first, so the rest of the module makes more sense as we go through it. The supply base evaluation is the mechanism the organization uses to decide whether feedstock can be treated as SBP compliant. There are 4 routes to compliance, options A through D, and feedstock qualifies if any one of them applies. Option A. The risk assessment concludes low risk on all indicators. This is the simplest case. Whether the organization uses a regional risk assessment, an RRA published by SBP, or its own company risk assessment, a CRA, if every indicator comes out as low risk, the feedstock is compliant and no further mitigation is required. Option B. The risk assessment identifies specified risks, but risk management measures have effectively reduced those risks to low. This is the most common real-world route. The key word is effectively. The organization has to show evidence that the measures actually work, not just that they exist on paper. Option K. Processing residues certified against an SBP recognized certification scheme. Here, the organization relies on 2 pieces of evidence. First, that the material genuinely qualifies as processing residues, and second, that it carries certification from a scheme SBP has recognized for this purpose. Both pieces of evidence are needed. Option D, post-consumer feedstock. For post-consumer material, the organization simply needs solid evidence that the feedstock genuinely falls into that category. To summarize, low risk across the board, specified risks effectively mitigated, certified processing residues, or demonstrable post-consumer feedstock. Any one of these 4 routes makes the feedstock SBP compliant. Now that you have the big picture, let us work through each section one by one. As we go, I will pause on the points that matter in practice, where interpretation is important, where the version 2.1 updates apply, and where you will want to focus when implementing the requirements. Let's start with section 1, supply base definition and mapping. Before we get into the detailed requirements of section 1, it is worth pausing on 2 foundational concepts that underpin everything that follows: the supply base itself and the sourcing area. These 2 terms are used a lot, and they are sometimes treated as interchangeable. They are not. Getting the distinction clear now will make the rest of the module much easier to follow. Let us start with the supply base. The supply base is the combination of the sourcing areas that an organization draws its feedstock from. It is the top-level concept, and importantly, a single supply base may span multiple countries. If a biomass producer sources wood from forests in 2 or 3 different countries, those countries together make up its supply base. The sourcing area is the building block underneath. A sourcing area is a geographically defined area from which the biomass feedstock is harvested for primary feedstock and processing residues, or generated in the case of post-consumer feedstock. 2 conditions have to be met for an area to qualify as a sourcing area. First, Reliable and independent information must be available about it. Second, the conditions within it must be sufficiently homogeneous to allow the organization to evaluate the sustainability and legality risks of the biomass. That homogeneity point is important. The sourcing area is the unit at which risk evaluation happens, so it needs to hold together as a coherent area where the same risk assessment applies. If conditions vary significantly within what you are calling one sourcing area, that is usually a sign that it should be split into subscopes or into separate sourcing areas. There is one point here that trips people up, so I want to be specific about it. The geographical meaning of sourcing area depends on the feedstock category. For primary feedstock and processing residues, the sourcing area is the country, or more precisely, the area where the feedstock is actually harvested. Think of it as the tree stump. Wherever that tree was felled, that is where the sourcing area is anchored. For post-consumer feedstock, the logic changes. You cannot trace a post-consumer chip back to a specific stump. The material has already lived a full life cycle as a product. So for post-consumer feedstock, the sourcing area is the country where the material is generated. In practice, that means the collection points where post-consumer reclaimed material is gathered before it enters the biomass supply chain. To summarize, supply base is the full combination, potentially across multiple countries. Sourcing area is the defined geographic unit within that supply base where risk evaluation happens, country of harvest for primary feedstock and processing residues, country of generation for post-consumer feedstock. Hold on to these two definitions because they come back throughout the rest of Standard 2. Now that the key concepts are clear, let us look at the actual requirements of Section 1, what the organization has to do to define and map its supply base. The supply base is the central concept in Standard 2. It covers all the relevant suppliers and stages in the biomass supply chain, from the place of harvesting or generation through to the organization's own operations. The organization must define the boundaries of its sourcing areas and map its supply base. All feedstock currently used or intended to be used in the production of SBP certified biomass must be included. The description must cover all suppliers involved in the production, harvesting, and transport of feedstock whose actions can affect conformance with SBP standards with names, addresses, and contact details. Feedstock must be categorized as primary, processing residues, or post-consumer. The records must show the relative volumes of each category. A practical point: good practice is to show the supply base on a map. Maps are standard in the forest industry, and ideally the map goes into the supply base report. At a minimum, it has to be available during the audit. How you keep these records is up to you: a spreadsheet, an internal database, or third-party software. Version 2.1 brings 4 specific updates that are worth calling out. First, the terminology has shifted. The word operators has been replaced throughout by suppliers. The underlying concept is the same. The entities involved in producing, harvesting, and transporting feedstock, but the new term is more consistent with how the supply chain is described across the SBP scheme. Second, for each certified supplier, you now need to record the certificate number and its validity, not just the fact that the supplier is certified. Third, Clause 1.1.2 now explicitly requires the organization to capture evidence about the certification status of the feedstock itself, where relevant. This was implicit before. It is now a stated requirement. In practice, where you are sourcing feedstock certified under FSC, PEFC, SFI, or another recognized scheme, you need to record that status and hold evidence of it. Fourth, in revised clause 1.1.9, feedstock volumes are now reported using 3 categories: RRA, CRA, or certified. Section 2 covers traceability, how the organization links its feedstock back to the supply base it has defined. The 3 requirements here are deliberately straightforward. 2 small clarifications were made in version 2.1, and I will flag them as we go through the detail. Section 2 sets out the traceability requirements. There are 3, each tied to a specific feedstock category. The first requirement applies to all feedstock. Everything the organization sources must be traceable back to the defined supply base. In practice, that means confirming that the sourcing area is within the supply base as the organization has defined and mapped it. If feedstock is coming from outside that defined area, traceability fails. The second requirement is specific to primary feedstock and processing residues. The organization must have access to records of the sourcing area for this feedstock. You need to know where it came from and have documentation to demonstrate it. Version 2.1 is explicit about this. Post-consumer feedstock is no longer included in this records requirement, only primary and processing residues. That documentation is also what feeds into the risk assessment process. You cannot evaluate risks in a sourcing area you cannot evidence. The third requirement is specific to post-consumer feedstock. When the organization sources post-consumer material, it must implement and comply with the requirements in Annex 1, SBP's processing residues, and post-consumer feedstock requirements. We will cover Annex 1 in detail at the end of this module. The key point here is that post-consumer feedstock does not follow the same traceability route as primary or processing residues. It has its own dedicated framework. Notice what that means in practical terms. For post-consumer feedstock, the organization does not need to trace the material back to the supply base in the same geographic sense as primary feedstock. The traceability requirement for post-consumer material is satisfied through the Annex 1 verification and inspection process, which focuses on supplier verification and category evidence rather than geographic origin. To put it simply, know where your primary feedstock and processing residues come from, back to the harvesting level origin, and make sure that sourcing area is within your defined supply base. For post-consumer feedstock, follow Annex 1, collect information on suppliers, their addresses, and trace back to the material reclamation point, that is the feedstock traceability system. Section 3 covers the supply base evaluation, the SBE, and how its different elements apply in practice. This is the largest section of the standard, so we'll take it step by step. Before we get into the specific requirements of Standard 2, it is worth stepping back and looking at how the supply base evaluation works as a whole. Think of this slide as a map of the journey. We will zoom into each element in the slides that follow, but first, let me walk you through the big picture. The supply base evaluation, or SBE, is a risk-based approach. Rather than prescribing a single set of rules that every biomass producer must follow in the same way, the SBE asks you to look at your own supply base, identify where the sustainability and legality risks actually sit, and then manage those risks proportionately. The framework is built on SBP's principles and criteria in Standard 1 for principles, 8 criteria, and 45 indicators. You can see them running across the top of the diagram: legality, biodiversity, environment, climate, carbon, sourcing, social, and community. These are the topics every supply base has to be evaluated against. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the 3 stages the evaluation moves through: supply base definition and traceability, risk assessment, and risk management. Let us take them in turn. Supply base definition and traceability we covered in the previous slides. These were sections 1 and 2 of the standard. Without this information, the next steps are not possible. Once you have that evidence, you move into risk assessment. This is the middle of the diagram, and it is where the key structural choice of Standard 2 shows up. There are 2 routes. If SBP has published a regional risk assessment, an RRA for your sourcing area, you use it. It is the official SBP assessment, and it delivers a risk rating for each indicator. It is mandatory to use. If no RRA is available for your area, then you conduct your own company risk assessment, a CRA, following the same logic. RRA where it exists, CRA where it does not. Whichever route you take, the outcome is the same. Each indicator ends up with a risk rating, either low risk or specified risk. Those are the only 2 options. If an indicator is rated low risk, you are done with that indicator. No further action is needed, and it feeds straight into your compliance conclusion. If an indicator is rated specified risk, you have to act. You move into the risk management stage, and that is where the risk management plan and risk management measures come in. The green box on the right, you develop measures to bring the specified risk down to a low level, and you verify that those measures are actually working. Once that is demonstrated, the feedstock linked to that indicator is also considered compliant. You will notice the FSC and PEFC logos in the bottom right. These are the SBP benchmarked certification schemes. When feedstock arrives certified under one of these schemes, the scheme itself does a lot of the work for you. For some indicators, the certification can be recognized as evidence of compliance or as a risk management measure in its own right. We will cover benchmarking in more detail a bit later, and we will also look at how different feedstock categories and certification statuses affect the SBE. To summarize, and again, this is the high-level view, the supply base evaluation is a structured journey. Define the supply base and establish traceability. Assess the risks, either through an SBP regional risk assessment or your own company risk assessment. Then manage any specified risks until you can demonstrate that all feedstock going into your SBP certified biomass is compliant. With that big picture in mind, let us now unpack each of these elements in detail. This slide zooms in on one of the most fundamental choices in Standard 2, whether the risk assessment is driven by a regional risk assessment published by SBP or by the biomass producer's own company risk assessment. Let us look at each side in turn. When an RRA is available, the left panel, a regional risk assessment is a desk-based assessment conducted by SBP covering an entire country or region. Where one exists for your sourcing area, it is mandatory to use it. You do not have the option to bypass it and conduct your own CRA instead. The RRA covers all 45 SBP indicators, and it delivers a risk rating for each one. The practical implication for the biomass producer is significant. You only need to address the specified risks that the RRA has identified. For every indicator the RRA rates as low risk, no further work is needed. This is a substantial reduction in workload compared to conducting your own assessment from scratch. When no RRA exists, the right panel. In this situation, the biomass producer must conduct its own company risk assessment. The CRA must cover all 45 indicators. There are no shortcuts. This is significantly more demanding than working from an RRA because the organization has to gather and evaluate evidence for every indicator itself rather than relying on a pre-published assessment. And unlike the RRA, which is prepared by SBP as a scheme-level document, the CRA is subject to direct verification by the certification body during the audit. So the choice between RRA and CRA is not really a choice, it is determined by SBP. If SBP has published an RRA for the area where your feedstock comes from, you use it. If not, you do the CRA yourself. The strategic implication is clear. Sourcing from areas covered by a published RRA is considerably less burdensome for the biomass producer. You will find a list of published RAs on the SBP website under normative documents. One more point worth noting, RAs are not all the same status. SBP publishes both interim RRAs, which are early stage assessments, and endorsed RRAs, which have completed the full review and stakeholder consultation process. The status of the RRA affects how it can be used in the risk assessment process. This slide introduces one of the most practically useful features of the SBP scheme for biomass producers who source certified feedstock, benchmarking. Benchmarking is the process by which SBP evaluates whether another certification scheme, such as FSC or PEFC, including national forest certification schemes endorsed by PEFC, covers the same requirements as SBP Standard 1, and to what extent. The purpose is to avoid duplication. If a certification scheme your supplier already holds has already addressed many of the Standard 1 indicators, it would be disproportionate to require a full risk assessment on top of that. Benchmarking is how SBP formalizes that recognition. SBP has developed a benchmarking and recognition framework. You can see it on the left of the slide. It is available on the SBP website under normative documents, The framework sets out a clear, transparent process for evaluating other certification schemes against SBP requirements. To date, two evaluations have been completed, one for FSC and one for PEFC. The two summary tables on the right show the outcomes of those evaluations. Each evaluation assessed every SBP certification requirement and gave it one of three verdicts. Yes means the scheme requirement is fully equivalent to SBP. Partial means there is some overlap but not complete equivalence. No means the requirement is not addressed by that scheme. For FSC, the result was 34 YES, 5 partial, and 3 NO. For PEFC, it was 31 YES, 5 partial, and 6 NO. In both cases, the large majority of SBP requirements are considered equivalent. For the indicators where the answer is YES, a biomass producer sourcing feedstock certified under FSC or PEFC can rely on that certification as evidence rather than conducting a full risk assessment for those indicators. The practical effect for biomass producers is significant. Where feedstock arrives with an FSC or PEFC claim, the benchmarking evaluation tells you exactly which SBP indicators that certification already addresses and which ones still require your own assessment or risk management. So benchmarking is not an all or nothing exemption. It is a targeted reduction in scope, and it makes the administrative burden of SBP certification significantly lower for biomass producers whose supply chains already rely heavily on FSC or PEFC certified sources. One practical note: at the time this training was published in April 2026, SBP was still revising benchmarking reports against standard v2.1 with the plan to publish updated documents by the effective date. Check the SBP website for the most recent versions before applying the benchmarking results to your own supply base evaluation. This is one of the most important slides in the whole module. This table defines exactly what the organization has to do to demonstrate conformance with Standard 2 for SBP compliant claims, and the answer depends on two things read together: the feedstock category and the certification status of the feedstock being received. With that in mind, let's walk through the table row by row. Primary feedstock not certified, that is, it arrives without an FSC, PEFC, or SFI certification claim. In this case, the organization must use either a regional risk assessment or its own company risk assessment, combined with risk management for any indicators rated as specified risk. Primary feedstock certified, it arrives with an FSC, PEFC, or SFI claim. The same CRA or RRA route applies, but importantly, the requirements of the certification scheme itself may be recognized as a risk management measure for the relevant indicators. So the certification claim doesn't eliminate the need for a risk assessment, but it can reduce the risk management burden for indicators the scheme already addresses. Processing residues not certified, no FSC, PEFC, or SFI claim on the incoming material. Here, the organization must first provide evidence that the feedstock genuinely qualifies as a processing residue, and then carry out a CRA or RA with risk management. Processing residues certified, the incoming material carries an FSC, PEFC, or SFI certification claim. The requirement is simpler: evidence that the feedstock is a processing residue, plus evidence that it is covered by that recognized certification. No separate CRA or RRA with risk management is required. Post-consumer feedstock. There is only one row here. Certification status does not create different routes for post-consumer material. The requirement is straightforward: evidence that the feedstock genuinely falls into the post-consumer category, in accordance with Annex 1. No CRA, RRA, or certification claim is required. The key takeaway from this table is that for primary feedstock and processing residues, what the organization needs to do is directly shaped by whether the incoming feedstock carries a certification claim. Certified feedstock with a real FSC, PEFC, or SFI claim from the supplier reduces the risk assessment workload, and for processing residues can replace the risk assessment and risk management processes entirely. Uncertified feedstock always requires the full CRA or RRA plus risk management route. The certification status of the feedstock is something the organization must record and evidence. This is one of the explicit additions in version 2.1, clause 1.1.2. It matters not just for traceability, but because it directly determines which conformance route applies here. So much for SBP compliant claims. On the next slide, we'll look at the parallel set of requirements for SBP controlled claims, where the routes look similar on the surface but involve some additional evidence requirements around due diligence systems. Now let's turn to the parallel table for SBP controlled claims. The structure is the same. Feedstock category on the left, feedstock certification status in the middle, conformance requirements on the right, but the specific evidence the organization needs is different. And as a reminder, the same rule applies here. The certification status refers to what the incoming feedstock arrives with, not to what the biomass producer itself holds.
Let's walk through the rows.
For primary feedstock, the organization needs evidence that the feedstock is certified by an SBP recognized certification scheme or by a controlled scheme recognized by SBP. In other words, the route into SBP controlled claims for primary feedstock runs through a recognized scheme, either a controlled scheme claim or a controlled material scheme. If the material is controlled material from an SBP recognized controlled scheme applied by biomass producer itself, two additional pieces of evidence are required. First, evidence that the scheme's due diligence system, the DDS, is certified. Second, confirmation that the last annual surveillance audit of that controlled scheme has not been waived. These two additional checks exist because controlled material doesn't carry the full weight of certification, so SBP needs assurance that the controlled scheme itself is being actively audited and its DDS is verified. For processing residues under controlled claims, the same logic applies. Evidence of the processing residues category, evidence of SBP recognized certification, and where controlled material is involved, the DDS certification and audit evidence on top. So the pattern here is consistent. SBP controlled claims rely on recognized certification as the primary evidence route, and where controlled material is the source, there is an additional layer of assurance around the due diligence system and annual auditing. Step back and compare with the previous slide. For SBP compliant claims, the biomass producer carries more of the risk assessment work itself. The CRA or RRA route is central. For SBP controlled claims, the scheme does more of that work up front through recognized certification and controlled schemes, and the biomass producer's role is to verify the scheme's status. In summary, feedstock category sets the baseline, and certification status determines the route. Before we work through next SBE elements in detail, this matrix shows you at a glance which elements you have to develop yourself and which ones come from SBP. Do not worry if the specific terms are not all familiar yet. We will unpack each of them in the slides that follow. Keep this matrix in mind as a reference as we go. The SBE is built from three main elements. The first is the supply-based verifier or SBV, the evidence sources the organization uses to assess the risk against each indicator in Standard 1. The second element is the risk assessment itself, together with the risk ratings that come out of it. Each indicator is rated either low or specified. The third element is the risk management plan, the RMP, which contains one or more risk management measures for any indicators rated as specified risk. Which of these elements you actually need to develop depends on the source of your feedstock. When an SBP regional risk assessment is available for the sourcing area, there is no need to develop your own supply-based verifiers or to carry out the risk assessment. The RRA has done that work for you. You still need to develop a risk management plan with risk management measures to address any specified risks that the RRA has identified. When no RRA exists and you are conducting a company risk assessment, you develop all 5 elements yourself: SBVs, the risk assessment, risk ratings, and then a risk management plan with risk management measures for any specified risks you identify. So the principle is simple. Use the RRA where it exists. Build your own SBVs and CRA where it does not. And always manage the specified risks. Let us talk about subscopes. The organization must establish supply-based subscopes where the risks of non-compliance with Standard 1 are not homogeneous across the supply base. A quick note on how this works in version 2.1. Subscopes are defined in the RRA for your sourcing area or where no RRA exists in your own company risk assessment. The biomass producer does not invent subscopes independently. The examples on this slide are the kinds of variants that typically lead an RRA or a CRA to set subscopes in the first place. Subscopes are defined as geographical areas or as otherwise clearly delineated sources of feedstock within the supply base, where the risks are uniform. They can apply to one indicator, several, or all of them. Let me run through the kinds of variants that typically lead to different risk conclusions. Jurisdictional, where different legislative or enforcement authorities apply across the supply base. Think countries, states, provinces, or counties. Ownership, where public land, private land, smallholders, or large landowners bring different rules and tenure arrangements. Environmental, differences in forest type, species composition, the presence of high-value biodiversity, or climate and soil conditions. Social, differences in resource use, community patterns, labor regulation, or how operations affect local communities. Economic, different management structures across the supply base. Business structure, different legal entities, management systems, or health and safety regimes. Certification type, feedstock certified against an SBP benchmark scheme such as FSC, PEFC, or SFI. And finally, feedstock from trees outside forests, TOFs, such as farmland, shelter belts, urban areas, and roadside plantings. A practical recommendation: identify subscopes at the very beginning of each indicator finding against Standard 1, before you start gathering information for SBVs, risk assessment, and risk management. A single risk designation is required at the end of each indicator finding based on the subscopes, and using subscopes will let you put different risk management measures in place for different feedstock sources and risk profiles. A few further requirements apply to the supply-based evaluation. The organization must keep the SBE up to date, keep records of any changes, review and revise it at least every 5 years, and make sure the SBE is carried out by a competent team. Let me be specific about when the SBE needs updating. If changes in the supply base or the supply chain affect the conclusions of the risk assessment, the organization must alter the risk management plan, and that triggers an immediate review and, where necessary, a revision of the SBE. Typical triggers include new legislation or jurisdictional changes, new feedstock sources being proposed, new suppliers or contractors coming into the supply base, new sustainability issues relevant to the SBP standards, and any failure of a risk management measure to address the specified risks it was meant to address. There is also a new trigger in version 2.1 under clause 3.6.2. If a published regional risk assessment changes status, for example, from SBP interim to SBP endorsed, the organization has 6 months to review its own SBE against the updated RRA and adjust it if needed. This is a specific time-bound requirement and worth flagging in your internal procedures. For more detail on all of this, I would point you to the guidance document that accompanies Standard 2. It walks through the triggers and the update process in more depth. Let us look at the conclusions of the supply-based evaluation. The organization evaluates the risk of non-conformance for each indicator in Standard 1, considering both the probability that non-conformance occurs and the severity of its consequences. Every indicator in Standard 1 must have an individual risk rating. Where an SBP regional risk assessment is available, the biomass producer does not conduct the risk assessment itself. The RRA provides the conclusions. Where no RRA exists, the biomass producer develops its own assessment. If the organization uses subscopes for any indicator, each subscope is evaluated independently and each one ends with a single risk rating. There are only 2 possible ratings: low or specified. Low risk is concluded when sufficient controls or management systems are in place, and their implementation delivers verifiable positive results, or put another way, the severity and probability of non-conformance are negligible. Specified risk applies in a range of situations. Any scenario where legislation or enforcement are lacking and where there are either no verifiable results at all or verifiable negative results leads to a specified risk conclusion. When a situation is not clearly low or clearly specified, the organization has to consider the scale and intensity of the issue before concluding. Stakeholder engagement can help rationalize the risk designation. But the principle is clear. Any risk that cannot be justified as low must be concluded as specified. This is one of the two genuinely new requirements introduced in version 2.1, clause 3.12. It addresses an important principle, and I want to spend a moment unpacking it because it has real practical consequences. The core idea is simple, and it is the message on the slide. If feedstock does not meet Standard 1, it is not compliant, regardless of what the published risk rating says. Let me give you a concrete example. Suppose an indicator relating to forest conversion is rated as low risk in the published regional risk assessment for a given area, but the biomass producer identifies that feedstock is being received from a source where forest conversion is taking place, and that means the feedstock does not meet the requirements of Standard 1. In that situation, the feedstock cannot be considered compliant, regardless of the risk rating. So what must the organization do when this happens? Three things. First, reevaluate the risk assessment tools. Review and update the assessments that fail to identify the non-compliance, the RRA, the company risk assessment, the risk management measures, and the risk management plan. Keep a record of that evaluation. Second, inform your certification body. The organization must notify its CB of the non-compliant feedstock situation without delay. Third, the certification body reports the case to SBP. That escalation can trigger a scheme-level review of the risk conclusion, including a review of the published RRA and, where applicable, a revision of the CRA. The key message: a risk rating is a tool to guide effort, not a shield against reality. If the feedstock does not meet Standard 1, it is not compliant. And the system has a clear feedback loop to make sure the risk assessment catches up with what is actually happening in the supply base. Next, Section 4, Supply Base Reporting. The supply base reporting requirements are straightforward. The organization prepares a supply base report, the SBR, using the SBP audit portal. The SBR typically includes a description of the company, the scope and the supply base, a quantification of the supply base, the results of the risk assessments, the risk management plan, the stakeholder engagement process, and the report authors and approval. The SBR must be updated at least annually. The organization must also make the report, including Annex 1, where applicable, available on request to stakeholders. A good practice is to publish the current SBR on the organization's website. The audit portal user guide gives detailed instructions on preparing the report. You can also visit the templates section on the SBP website for a PDF template. Note that the report itself is completed directly in the audit portal, but the template is useful to review in advance. Moving on to Section 5, Supply-Based Verifiers. Supply-based verifiers, or SBVs, are how the organization demonstrates conformance with the indicators in Standard 1. There are three important rules about them. First, SBVs must not remove or weaken the indicators set out in Standard 1, and they must not alter the intent of those indicators. In other words, the bar set by Standard 1 is the bar. Second, for each indicator, the organization must identify and maintain a list of SBVs following a defined structure. That structure has up to 5 steps, and you can see them on the slide. Step 1. Identify all applicable laws within the supply base that cover the relevant indicator of Standard 1. Step 2. Determine SBVs to evaluate whether those laws are enforced. Step 3. Determine SBVs to evaluate whether the laws are implemented by suppliers in the supply base. Step 4. If the organization cannot determine whether the applicable laws are enforced and implemented, it must determine SBVs that evaluate whether suppliers are implementing best practices that demonstrably meet the indicators of Standard 1. Note that in version 2.1, this step is now explicitly conditional. It applies only when the first 3 steps are inconclusive. Step 5, new in version 2.1, under clause 5.3.5, the organization must also determine SBVs to evaluate the current conditions on the ground. This closes a gap that was present in version 2.0 and aligns Standard 2 with the risk evaluation framework. Third, and finally, there is also a new efficiency in version 2.1 clause 5.4, which we will cover in the next slide. In short, if a biomass producer sources exclusively primary feedstock certified against an SBP benchmark certification scheme, the scope of the SBV work can be reduced to only the indicators not fully covered by that scheme. Clause 5.4 is a new requirement introduced in version 2.1, and it is a genuine efficiency gain for biomass producers whose primary feedstock is certified. The rule is this: if a biomass producer sources exclusively primary feedstock certified against an SBP benchmark certification scheme, FSC, PEFC, or SFI, then the producer only needs to develop supply-based verifiers and conduct a risk assessment for the specific Standard 1 indicators that the benchmark scheme does not fully cover. The right-hand side of the slide shows how this works in practice. For each Standard 1 indicator, check how it was classified in the most recent SBP benchmarking report for that scheme. If the indicator is marked as fully met by the benchmarked scheme, no SBV work and no risk assessment work is required. That indicator is covered. If the indicator is marked as partially met, gap fill is required. You develop SBVs and run a risk assessment on the specific elements of the indicator that the scheme does not address. If the indicator is marked as not met, full SBV development and a risk assessment are required, as if the scheme did not cover it at all. 2 important practical points. First, and this is what the note on the bottom left of the slide flags, clause 5.4 applies only if all primary feedstock is certified. If any non-certified primary feedstock enters the supply base, the full scope of Standard 1 indicators applies. Second, clause 5.4 narrows scope, not responsibility. Every other Standard 2 obligation, traceability, reporting, subscope management, stakeholder engagement, the risk management plan where specified risks are identified, still applies. 5.4 simply prevents duplication where the benchmark scheme has already done the work. One housekeeping point. At the time this training was published in April 2026, the benchmarking reports were being revised against Standard v2.1. Before applying clause 5.4 in practice, check the SBP website for the latest benchmarking report for the certification scheme in question. Moving on to section 6, risk assessment. Let us talk about the risk assessment in practice. The organization must conduct a company risk assessment, a CRA, when a regional risk assessment is not available for the sourcing area. The purpose is the same in either case, to determine whether there is a risk that the feedstock sourced does not conform with the requirements of Standard 1, using the identified SBVs. The company risk assessment must cover all activities within the supply base that have an impact on conformance with Standard 1. That is language that changed in version 2.1. The previous wording referred to all operators. It now refers more broadly to all activities to make clear that the scope of the assessment is about what is happening on the ground, not just who is doing it. A low-risk conclusion can only be reached in 2 situations. The first is where legislation addressing the Standard 1 requirement exists and is enforced, and suppliers are demonstrating legal compliance. The second is where, in the absence of adequate legislation, suppliers are demonstrating best practice that meets the intent of the Standard 1 indicator. The risk rating must be justified using the identified SBVs, and this justification must be included in the supply-based report. And finally, the risk assessment must be signed off by senior management in the organization. This is not a formality. It is the accountability step that anchors the whole process at the right level. When you build your CRA procedures, build in a clear sign-off stage with senior management visibility. Section 7, Risk Management. Section 7 brings us to risk management. This is where the organization acts on the conclusions of the risk assessment. The central tool is the Risk Management Plan, or RMP. Wherever an indicator has been rated as specified risk, the organization must develop one or more risk management measures, RMMs, to bring that risk down to low. The RMP is where all those measures are brought together, along with how they will be implemented, monitored, and verified. The fundamentals are these: identify and implement relevant risk management measures, regularly monitor their implementation to confirm they are actually effective, and if the harm cannot be avoided even with mitigation, exclude the feedstock from the supply chain altogether. Where RMMs are found to be ineffective in reducing risk, the feedstock loses its SBP compliant status until further measures are implemented and shown to work. Version 2.1 makes two important additions to this picture. First, Clause 7.2. The organization must implement any RMMs marked as mandatory in SBP regional risk assessments or in other normative documents. This is a broader scope than version 2.0, which referred only to mandatory measures in instruction documents. Where SBP has identified measures as mandatory anywhere in its normative framework, they are not optional. Second, Clause 7.4. The organization must implement the risk management plan and establish a process to evaluate operators' compliance with the plan. The intent is clear: enforce the RMP at the forest level, where applicable. It is no longer enough to have a good plan on paper. The organization has to confirm that the measures are actually being applied on the ground. Auditors will look for evidence of this evaluation process, so document how you do it. That enforcement point, applying the RMP at the forest level, raises a very practical question. How do you actually do this in practice? Risk mitigation looks different depending on where in the supply chain you are operating, and it is rarely something a biomass producer can fully control on its own. So let us turn to the key principles that guide effective risk mitigation. So how does risk mitigation actually work in practice? Standard 2 sets the requirements, but applying them day to day rests on a few practical principles that experience has shown to matter most. Let me walk you through them. The first and most important principle is that collaboration with suppliers and sub-suppliers up the supply chain is critical. Risk mitigation is almost never something a biomass producer can do alone. The specified risks usually sit upstream with the forest owner, the logging contractor, or the wood trader, and that means the biomass producer has to work with those actors, share information, and agree on what will change. Treat risk mitigation as a joint effort, not a compliance task you impose on your suppliers. The second principle is that risk mitigation usually needs to be applied at the forest level. The sustainability issues Standard 1 addresses legality, biodiversity, labor practices, carbon are determined by what happens in and around the forest itself. That is where the specified risk originates, and that is where the mitigation has to land. The third principle follows directly. Delegating risk management to forest level actors is often necessary. You will rarely be in a position to implement RMMs yourself at the forest. What you can do is identify who has the operational control: forest owners and managers, forest logging contractors, wood traders, and put in place a clear framework for them to apply the measures. Then you verify through your evaluation process under Clause 7.4 that they actually do. Keep in mind that the ultimate responsibility stays with the biomass producer. Delegation is an operational tool, not a transfer of accountability. If the RMMs are not effectively applied, the feedstock loses its SBP compliant status, regardless of who was supposed to apply them. Let us briefly look at the kinds of evidence that typically support risk mitigation. Standard 2 is not prescriptive about what you must use. What matters is that the evidence is credible, relevant, and kept on file. In practice, the kinds of sources most often used include International and national databases, for example, forest area and land use datasets, sites records, enforcement registers, official maps and satellite imaging, for example, national forest inventories, forest management plans, operational protocols, and harvesting protocols maintained at the forest level. Results of relevant compliance audits and inspections, whether from the certification body, from public authorities, or from your own supplier monitoring visits, and contractual agreements with suppliers, which set out specifically what the supplier has committed to do. The principle is the same as for SBVs. The evidence has to be genuinely informative about the risk you are trying to manage. A contract that says supplier will comply with all applicable laws is not evidence of compliance. It is a statement of expectation. Next to Section 8, Stakeholder Engagement. Stakeholder engagement is a cornerstone of the supply-based evaluation. The central requirement is this. Before finalizing the SBE, or whenever the SBE is updated, the organization must engage with its stakeholders, and this includes conducting a stakeholder consultation. Version 2.1 introduces that exact phrase, conducting a stakeholder consultation, and auditors will look for evidence that a structured consultation, not just in formal contact, actually took place. Here is the important change in version 2.1, and I want to be precise about it. The scope of what must be consulted on is now conditional on which risk assessment route the organization is using. Supply-based verifiers and the risk assessment with its risk ratings are consulted on only if the organization is using a company risk assessment. Where an SBP regional risk assessment is in use, those elements are provided by SBP, and no stakeholder consultation on them is required from the biomass producer. The risk management plan, the risk management measures, and the means of verification are consulted on regardless whether the organization is using a CRA or an IRA. These are the elements the biomass producer is responsible for developing in every case, and they are always in scope for consultation. The practical implication is that for biomass producers in regions covered by an endorsed RRA, the consultation workload is noticeably reduced. For biomass producers operating under a CRA, the full scope of the consultation remains. A few further points. The organization must engage with stakeholders each time the SBE is revised. A minimum of 1 month must be given for stakeholders to provide feedback before the SBE is finalized. The organization must seek to address relevant stakeholder concerns, but it is important to be realistic about what address means. It is not required to achieve consensus with stakeholders. What is required is genuine engagement with the issues raised. The organization has to provide adequate information as a basis for informed comment, but it does not have to disclose confidential information. Records must be kept. Lists of individuals and organizations invited to comment, copies of all correspondence and comments received, and records of the feedback provided to stakeholders on their comments and the revised supply-based report. Where to look for stakeholders? Think broadly. Communities near the operations, NGOs, local and national authorities, trade unions, other biomass producers, forest managers, and scientific or academic bodies. Develop your own database, updating it with each engagement cycle. Practical methods, emails and letters, public announcements, meetings, site visits, phone calls, social media, websites, and community forums. Use the combination that best fits your supply base and the stakeholders within it. Finally, Annex 1, the requirements for processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. Annex 1 sets out specific requirements for processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. The annex is built around 3 elements that work together: verification, inspection, and audit. First, verification and monitoring. The organization must conduct a verification process for its suppliers of processing residues and post-consumer feedstock to determine whether the feedstock is genuinely eligible for the SBE exemptions. For each supplier, the organization defines the necessary evidence, the actions, and the record-keeping procedures that confirm the feedstock complies with the relevant SBP definitions. Second, inspection and categorization on receipt. When the feedstock arrives, the organization visually inspects it and confirms its categorization, either as processing residues or as post-consumer feedstock. Documentary evidence of the delivery and inspection must be retained. Where evidence at the point of receipt is inadequate, the supplier has to be added to the supplier audit program and conformance confirmed before the feedstock is used. Third, supplier audit. Annual or more frequent on-site audits of suppliers are required, including overseas suppliers. Version 2.1 clarifies a useful exception. Traders or sales offices that do not take physical possession of the material and do not alter, store, or repackage it can be verified remotely through desk audits. For any supplier handling the material, on-site is still the expectation. One clarification deserves emphasis. A declaration from the supplier, even if it is part of the contractual agreement, is not sufficient proof of origin or feedstock category. You need the evidence, the inspections, and the audits backing it up. This closes a common compliance gap. All of this must be fully documented. Audit dates, findings, names and qualifications of auditors, and examples of the evidence concerning categorization. A few specifics worth noting. Post-consumer feedstock can include construction and demolition waste, residential wood waste, and industrial post-use material. The key test is that the wood has completed at least one full life cycle for its intended end use. Processing residues, on the other hand, are byproducts of a manufacturing process. Think sawdust, shavings, bark, and offcuts. We've covered a lot of ground in this module, so let me pull the version 2.1 main changes together on a single page. Think of it in 3 columns. On the left, genuinely new requirements. There are 4 clause 3.12, which says identified non-conforming feedstock is never SBP compliant regardless of the risk rating. Clause 5.3.5, which adds a step to the SBV cascade for current conditions on the ground. Clause 5.4, which streamlines the workload where primary feedstock is certified to an SBP benchmark scheme. And clause 7.4, which says you must implement the risk management plan and actively evaluate that your operators are complying with it. In the middle, clarifications that formalize positions that were already in normative interpretations or scheme practice. The SBE applicability table has been restructured and made clearer. Subscopes are now defined in the RRA or CRA, not by the biomass producer alone. An RRA status change triggers a 6-month SBE review, and stakeholder consultation is now conditional on whether a CRA is in use. On the right, terminology cleanup. Operators in Section 1 has become suppliers. CRA is now the named term for the biomass producer's own risk assessment. SBP RRA drops the word endorsed. And clause 6.2 talks about activities rather than operators. Taken together, version 2.1 is an evolutionary update. The scheme structure is the same, the requirements are clearer, and the 2 main new requirements, 3.12 and 5.4, are formalizations of already published normative interpretations that most biomass producers were already following in practice. Before we close, a reminder about EU RED. SBP certified biomass must also comply with the SBP EU RED requirements. This is explicitly mentioned in the section scope. Biomass producer must now also be certified against the EU RED instruction document. The SBP and EU RED requirements are largely aligned, and that alignment has improved further with the publication of standards v2.1. But there are also important differences, particularly around definitions, risk assessments, wording, non-conformances, and the specific evidence EU RED audit reporting. For the detail, please refer to the separate SBP EU RED training module. It walks through the specific requirements, the areas of overlap with Standard 2, and the areas where EU RED differs from SBP. A short module, but essential for all SBP stakeholders. Before we close, let me pull the whole module together with 6 key takeaways. If you remember nothing else from this session, these are the points I'd ask you to hold on to. First, Standard 1 defines the sustainability bar, 4 principles, 8 criteria, and 45 indicators, with version 2.1 adding 3 new indicators to align with the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, RED3. That's the bar every biomass producer has to clear. Second, Standard 2 is the risk-based verification engine that biomass producers use to demonstrate they've cleared that bar, where Standard 1 tells you what sustainable biomass looks like, Standard 2 tells you how to prove it. The supply-based definition, the risk assessment, the risk management plan, the supply-based report, the stakeholder engagement, they all serve that single purpose. Third, the risk assessments provide the country-level foundation. Whether you rely on an SBP regional risk assessment, where one is available, or on your own company risk assessment when it isn't, the assessment gives you your starting point. But remember, every indicator rated as specified risk must be mitigated. Risk assessment without risk management is only half the system. Fourth, version 2.1 strengthens the system in several important ways. Better capturing of data about certified feedstock. The evidence overrides in clause 3.12. If you see something on the ground that contradicts the risk rating, the evidence wins. Clarified traceability requirements. Cleaner RRA and CRA terminology, and a range of other clarifications we've covered throughout the module. Version 2.1 isn't a rewrite of Standard 2, it's a sharpening of it. Fifth, FSC and PEFC benchmarking streamlines the process, but it doesn't replace it. Where benchmarking has confirmed that a certification scheme fully addresses an indicator, you don't have to duplicate the work, but you still have to map which indicators are covered, which are only partially covered, and which aren't covered at all, and you still have to manage the risks that sit outside what the benchmark scheme delivers. And sixth, processing residues and post-consumer feedstock have special rules. These feedstock categories are treated differently from primary feedstock throughout Standard 2. Different traceability requirements, simplified routes to compliance where certification is in place, and a dedicated set of verification, inspection, and audit requirements in Annex 1. If you work with these materials, Annex 1 is essential reading. That brings us to the end of this module on SBP Standard 2. For further support, please refer to the guidance document that accompanies Standard 2, the Audit Portal User Guide for Supply-Based Reporting, and the normative interpretations published by SBP. The links on this slide will take you straight to each of these resources. If you have questions, send an email to the SBP team. Thank you for your time.